Welcome to Windscale. Two nuclear reactors quickly assembled in what we now refer to as Sellafield, Cumbria. The British government had a clear aim: to stay competitive with the Americans and the Soviets in the nuclear arms race. And similar to a usual DIY weekend project, they did not stick to the instructions. On October 10th, 1957, in the heart of Windscale's Unit 1 reactor, the situation quickly shifted from, that's strange, to, oh no, what have we done, in no time at all. The reactor thought it was the perfect moment for a barbecue. The kind of barbecue with a 3-day-long blazing fire. But instead of burgers and hot dogs, it was releasing radioactive contamination right into the air. Are you craving some iodine-131 along with a touch of cesium-137? Good, because that's exactly what you're getting. But how did that happen? So the reactors were made to produce weapons-grade plutonium for the British atomic bomb project, but rather than thinking, maybe we should be careful with this whole nuclear energy idea, they just chose to rush things along. One way they improved the reactor's efficiency was by cooling it with air blown through the core. Yeah, air. The scientific version of waving a piece of paper to cool off on a hot day and thinking it'll fix global warming. And guess what? Cooling a nuclear reactor with air proved to be just as useful as trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. The heat in the core just kept rising, and before anyone realized it, the reactor was on fire. No need to worry, right? It's just a fire at a nuclear reactor. What's the worst that could happen? It turns out that the fire was not just like a simple grab the fire extinguisher type of situation. It felt more like, oh no, it's releasing radioactive particles into the air and we don't know how to stop it. Because that's exactly what happened. For 3 long, frightening days, the fire raged, sending a mix of radioactive particles into the air like a harmful scent. Iodine-131, well known for its role in causing thyroid cancer, took center stage, accompanied by small amounts of other elements like cesium-137 and polonium-210 for added effect. The best part? They didn't inform people. The British government faced a tricky situation. How do you confess that your secret nuclear bomb project is spiraling out of control without triggering widespread panic? It's straightforward, you just don't. Instead, they calmly handled the situation as radioactive contamination spread throughout Europe. It's like when you accidentally break something at home and try to fix it with glue before anyone sees. It seems okay before someone touches it, and then it just falls apart. But here's the twist. After the fire was finally put out by, dumping a lot of water straight onto the reactor core, because no way that causes any issues, right? There was a small problem with the milk. Yeah, the milk. It turns out that radioactive iodine-131 is really good at getting into the food chain. And in this situation, it ended up in the grass the nearby cows were eating. And the outcome? Britain's best radioactive milk, straight from the farm. It was so polluted that the government had to dispose tons of it. And what about the people? Even though the government tried hard to minimize the disaster, it's believed that the radioactive fallout from Windscale led to hundreds of cancer cases. This disaster was just caused by a mistake. It was a rushed project, poor designs, and a chain of mistakes that resulted in the most dangerous nuclear disaster in the UK. They didn't even put up a containment dome around the reactor core because, why worry about safety measures when you're in a hurry, right? Yeah, it was messed up. And if Windscale was Britain's way of saying, oops, we broke the reactor, then the Kishinev nuclear disaster was the Soviet Union's way of saying, just wait and see. Ah, the Soviet Union. Place of mystery, industrial achievement, and unexpected nuclear blasts. Imagine this. It's the 1950s and the Cold War is happening all around us. The Americans are proudly displaying their new nuclear weapons, and obviously the Soviets feel the need to match them. Welcome to the Mayak plant, a highly confidential site situated close to the lovely town of Kishinev. When I say top secret, I really mean it was so hidden that even most people nearby had no idea it was there. Because nothing shows confidence in your government like being completely unaware of the nuclear danger right in your backyard. The Mayak plant had a clear task: to produce as much weapons-grade plutonium as it could. In classic Soviet style, they didn't allow minor issues like safety or proper maintenance to hinder their objectives. Nah, that wouldn't make any sense. The cooling system in one of their waste storage tanks had been malfunctioning for a long time. But rather than repair it, they chose the old approach of acting as if everything was okay. The method of just overlooking the check engine light. Because what's the worst that can happen? Spoiler alert, explosion, a big one. On September 29th, 1957, the broken cooling system finally failed, and a huge explosion shook the Mayak plant. When I say massive, I really mean it had the power of around 70 to 100 tons of TNT. To give you an idea, it was like setting off a small nuclear bomb, without the cool mushroom cloud. The explosion blew the lid off the tank and sent a cloud of radioactive material high into the sky. And this is where it becomes really enjoyable. The Soviets, known for their secrecy, kept what happened to themselves. Why should the locals be concerned about a bit of radioactive fallout when they can continue their lives as if everything is completely normal? And so they did, while nuclear material fell over an area of around 20,000 square kilometers. People just continued with their daily lives, eating, drinking, and inhaling a significant amount of radiation. No problem. A week later, exactly 7 days, the government finally thought, maybe we should take action. So they started to evacuate around 10,000 people from the area. But at that point, the harm was already done. The radiation had already spread widely, affecting everything it touched. It was like a game of tag, but instead of being it, you would die to radiation poisoning. So somehow, even more fun. But here's the surprising part. Since the plant kept everything so hidden, the disaster went unnoticed by the outside world for many years. While people in Kishtim might not have been shining in the dark, the rest of the world was still completely unaware. It wasn't until 1976, almost 20 years later, that a Russian scientist left for the West and revealed the truth about the disaster. The Kishtim disaster was, in a way, the Soviet Union's hidden toxic secret that they tried to hide away. And the Mayak plant, of course, didn't stop after just one nuclear disaster. It kept running for many years following the explosion, and they experienced a number of other incidents throughout the years. But Kishtim was definitely the most severe. The area surrounding the plant remains one of the most polluted spots on the planet. Why bother cleaning up a nuclear disaster when you can just let it stand as a reminder of our mistakes? And so, the Soviet government didn't officially acknowledge the disaster until 1989. For more than 30 years, they were able to hide one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. Radiation? What radiation? No need to stress about it, buddy. Everything's okay. And although it's not as well known as Chernobyl, it definitely deserves a spot in the Hall of Fame for nuclear disasters. So the next time you find yourself grumbling about a dripping faucet or a faulty air conditioner, just keep in mind, at least you're not facing a cooling system that could actually explode and wipe out your whole neighborhood. Ah, America, the country of freedom, democracy, and, seemingly, huge pools of radioactive waste. Welcome to Church Rock, New Mexico, where the American dream fell apart, in the North Fork of the Puerco River. Alright, so it's July 16th, 1979. You wake up in your calm countryside town, looking forward to a peaceful day. And instead, you find tons of radioactive sludge flowing down the river. Just another Monday in America, right? This radioactive nightmare is brought to you by the Church Rock Mill of the United Nuclear Corporation. For years, they mined uranium, extracting all that radioactive material from the earth. Like any responsible company, they built a dam to manage the waste properly. A dam, I should mention, that was constructed as sturdily as a Jenga tower made out of bowling pins. Yeah, picture that. I'm not even gonna try, just put that image in your brain. Feel the metaphor there. Anyway, so on the morning of July 16th, that dam decided that it was time to let go of all the fun it had been holding back. It fell apart, releasing about 1,100 tons of uranium mill waste and 94 million gallons of radioactive water into the Puerco River. Yeah, 94 million gallons. That's about 142 Olympic-sized swimming pools. But if you tried to swim in it, you'd acquire more limbs. Among other things. The spill polluted 2 aquifers, which meant that the river wasn't the only thing affected. The groundwater was affected too. And to add to the problem, the radioactive waste flowed back into the sewers, which is definitely not where you want your radiation, right in your plumbing. There's nothing quite like using the bathroom and thinking you might get splashed with water that's contaminated with uranium. Now you may be wondering, surely the government stepped in to assist, right? Ha, that's really cute. When the Navajo Tribal Council sent a message to the governor of New Mexico, asking him to declare a state of emergency, he just dismissed it and said, nah, you're fine. The state and national officials brushed off the incident so much, it felt like they were trying out for a cover-up reality show. The lasting impacts were really harmful. The Navajo Nation's land and water have been polluted for many years. Animals drank from the toxic river, plants were watered with contaminated water, and people had no option but to exist in a polluted land that those in charge appeared to ignore. The US government noticed the consequences and just thought, well, it's just the desert, what could go wrong? Yeah, that one was one of the most messed up, because nobody did anything about it. Oh, Fukushima. If there was ever a true example of when it rains, it pours, this is it. Just swap the raining and pouring for a 9.0 magnitude earthquake and a 15-meter tsunami, because Japan really doesn't do things halfway. Okay, so it's March 11th, 2011, a beautiful Friday afternoon. You're having some sushi, maybe looking at your emails, when out of nowhere the ground begins to shake like it's having a seizure. But it doesn't end there. Just when you believe it's over, a huge wave rushes over the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, And let's just say that it gets worse from that point on. The earthquake was already terrible, but the tsunami was the true disruptor. It turned off the power supply and cooling systems in the plant, which, as you can imagine, is pretty crucial when working with nuclear reactors. In just a few hours, the situation at the plant changed from under control to, oh no, the reactor's melting down. In the following days, 3 of the plant's nuclear reactors had complete meltdowns, as if one meltdown wasn't sufficient. When nuclear reactors melt down, they don't just quietly simmer like a pot on the stove. No, they burst, releasing radioactive material into the air like confetti at the worst parade ever. Once everything calmed down, for real, over 100,000 people had been moved to safety, and the world faced a new nuclear disaster to remember. Over 1,000 deaths have been linked to the turmoil and disorder of relocating more than 100,000 individuals from the disaster area. People had to leave their homes, their ways of making a living were ruined, and for many, the pressures of having to evacuate was just as harmful as the radiation. In contrast to other disasters where the harm is limited to a small region, Fukushima's radioactive fallout traveled across the Pacific Ocean, reaching all the way to the west coast of the US. It seems that when Japan has a serious issue, everyone around the world gets involved. Clearly the plant setup was not ready for this type of disaster. Further investigations show that the risk predictions for an event of this size were, to put it mildly, overly hopeful at best. It seemed like they were thinking, nah, what are the chances of a huge earthquake and a big tsunami occurring at once? We're fine. But the joke's on them because nature doesn't pay attention to your risk evaluations. The next time you hear a tsunami warning, it's probably best to not ignore it, because you never know when it could be accompanied by a nuclear meltdown. Also, if you made it this far, you may as well subscribe. You know what, I can't not talk about Chernobyl in this video. It's just such an insane event that we have to cover it. Trust me, the story is so worth it. If nuclear accidents were in a competition, Chernobyl would take the top spot. This disaster feels like the storyline of every 80s apocalypse movie combined, without the corny lines. Though honestly, some of the real conversations between the plant's operators that night were probably even cheesier than any Hollywood script. It's April 26th, 1986, and we find ourselves in the Soviet Union. A land famous for its, I don't know what, but let's just continue with the disaster. That night, at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine, the group at reactor number 4 chose to conduct a safety test. That's right, a safety test. Nothing shows irony better than testing a system's safety and ending up causing the worst nuclear disaster ever. It's like choosing to test smoke detectors in your home by actually starting a fire in the kitchen. The reactor they were testing was a Soviet RBMK design, which, as you might guess, had some serious flaws. But hey, it was the 80s, and the Soviet Union was more focused on creating weapons-grade nuclear materials than on ensuring the reactor stayed safe from explosions. The plant operators, using this advanced ticking device, chose to turn off the safety systems to mimic a power outage. Thinking that was a smart choice in the moment, they overlooked several rules and regulations, but who's keeping track? What happened next was a really terrifying scene involving nuclear disaster. In just a few seconds, reactor number 4 changed from, let's see if we can manage a power outage, to, oh no, the core is about to explode, and it certainly did. A huge steam explosion tore through the reactor, sending the 1,000-ton lid of the core soaring into the sky. Because what's a bit of nuclear debris in the air among friends? The explosion was incredibly strong, blowing off the roof of the reactor building and letting out a radioactive cloud. But the real surprise is the plant operators didn't fully understand how serious the situation was at first. Even after the explosion, some of them believed they could just manage it, like someone who thinks they can fix a spilled drink by placing a paper towel over it. One paper towel. And this time, the drink was just radiation, and the spill was a deadly cloud of radioactive isotopes spreading across Europe like the worst weather report imaginable. And while we're at it, let's give a round of applause to the plant's leaders who, in classic bureaucratic style, believed they could just ignore the whole situation. Just hours after the explosion, the nearby town of Pripyat was carrying on with its daily activities as if nothing had happened. The children were off to school, parents were on their way to work, and during all this, radiation levels were rising to shocking heights. No problem, right? When the authorities finally chose to evacuate Pripyat, 36 hours later, everyone in the town had been exposed to so much radiation that they could glow in the dark. The Soviet government, known for its lack of openness, first minimized the seriousness of the disaster. It was only when radiation alarms began ringing in Sweden, yeah, Sweden, as in relatively far away from Russia, that the rest of the world realized something might be a little wrong in Ukraine. Right after the event, 30 plant workers and first responders lost their lives due to acute radiation poisoning. But that figure doesn't fully reflect the complete impact of the disaster. The radioactive cloud from Chernobyl really didn't care about borders. It drifted wherever the wind blew, spreading its harmful effects across Belarus, Russia, and a large part of Western Europe. Radiation from Chernobyl was actually found even in the US. So, how'd they clean it up? The Soviet response was honestly remarkable. Or, quite shocking, based on how you see it. Meet the liquidators, many soldiers, firefighters, and everyday workers who went into the dangerous radioactive area to help clean up the disaster. With just shovels, gas masks, and a faint hope that their governments might reward them, these unfortunate individuals were given the heavy responsibility of extinguishing radioactive fires, burying contaminated soil, and even putting down irradiated pets that had been abandoned during the evacuation. The entire situation felt like a bad dream of a summer camp task. Like, okay kids, we're gonna scoop radioactive graphite back into the core. Don't worry, you'll only be around dangerous levels of radiation for just a few minutes. Next on our enjoyable tour around nuclear disasters, Toikamura. It's just another regular Tuesday in Japan, where workers at a nuclear plant might have thought, what could possibly happen if we had a bit too much uranium? Well, it turns out, a lot can go wrong. I've talked about this one before in the recent worst deaths in human history. In this video, I'm going to go into details about this incident. The Toikamura nuclear disaster is like when someone attempts to bake cookies and uses salt instead of sugar. But instead of ruining the dessert, it leads to an unexpected chain of nuclear fission. Oops. Everything happened at the JCO uranium processing facility in Toikamura on September 30th, 1999. A day that Japan will always remember as the day a chemistry experiment went terribly wrong. Imagine workers dealing with highly enriched uranium as they try to create nuclear fuel for a reactor. These workers, who clearly weren't following the nuclear safety guidelines, like did they even bother to read them, chose to pour too much uranium into a precipitation tank, because why not? And they ended up using 7 times more uranium than allowed by law. That's not just a small mistake, that's like adding way too much chili powder to your soup and then being shocked when it's too spicy to handle. But in this situation, your soup is radioactive and your mouth is Japan. Did that metaphor track? I don't know. And what happens if you put too much uranium into a tank? You end up with a runaway nuclear chain reaction, that's what happens. It's like the reaction saying, no one said I should stop, and then it just keeps fissioning away like a nuclear Energizer bunny on steroids. And the chain reaction continued for almost 20 hours. 20 hours! Take a moment to think about that. This wasn't just a small problem, it was like someone started a huge fire and then just watched it, hoping it would disappear by itself. Unfortunately, the initial victims of this disaster were the low-income workers who were nearest to the location. Hisashi Aochi and Masada Shinohara, the lab workers, were hit with such intense radiation that their bodies reacted with confusion, like, wait, what? Ochi in particular received an extremely high dose of radiation, estimated to be around 17 sieverts. To give you an idea, 5 sieverts can be lethal to a person. Ochi received over 3 times that amount. It's like drinking 3 gallons of dangerous Kool-Aid and thinking you'll be okay. And just a heads up, he wasn't. The results were quick and harsh. Ochi's body began to break down from the inside out. His organs started to fail, his skin came off, and doctors had to take extreme steps just to keep him alive. And they kept him alive, for 83 painful days of unimaginable suffering. Shinohara, who had a bit less exposure, managed to hold on for a few months, before also falling victim to radiation sickness. The medical team worked hard, but when facing radiation at such a high level, it felt like trying to fix a sinking ship with just band-aids. But those two were not the only ones exposed to radiation. Approximately 49 workers at the plant and emergency responders were exposed to different levels of radiation. Additionally, about 207 local residents were affected by radiation exposure. The nearby area had to be cleared out, and those who lived close by likely took some time to think hard about their choices of neighbors in the following weeks. Oh, the spot next to us? Yeah, that's the uranium factory. It's not a problem, until it becomes one. Ah, Goyonya. A tale that beautifully blends human curiosity, a hint of greed, and plenty of radioactive mishaps. Picture yourself in Brazil on a bright September day in 1987, and you stumble upon an empty medical clinic. You might be thinking, wow, there could be some useful scrap metal in this. I know that's what I'd be thinking. You might not realize it, but you're on the verge of creating one of the biggest radiological disasters ever. Here's how this mess began. A few scrap metal dealers found a piece of old medical equipment from a cancer treatment machine. They were unsure of what it was, but they spotted a shiny metal cylinder, and their inner magpies said, ooh, shiny. What they didn't realize was that this cylinder held cesium-137, a very radioactive isotope that you definitely want to avoid coming into contact with. The scrap dealers, completely unaware that they were dealing with a mini-nuclear bomb, brought the cylinder home and began to open it up. When they opened the cylinder, they saw something amazing inside. A shining blue powder. We've all watched enough movies to understand that if something shines in the dark, it's best to get away quickly. But not these people. They found this mysterious glowing substance so interesting that they chose to share it with their friends and family. They actually passed around the radioactive powder as if it were just like some kind of glitter from a party, but the glitter caused radiation burns. Before long, news traveled through the neighborhood about this amazing glowing powder in town, and everyone was eager to get some. Children were having fun with it, grown-ups were applying it to their skin, and someone even used it to paint their bodies. It felt like they were trying out for the most dangerous glow party ever. What's the issue? Cesium-137 doesn't just make you shine, it can also cause radiation poisoning. So after some partying and some enjoyment, people began to get very sick. Very, very sick. The authorities quickly noticed that something was very wrong, and when they looked into it, they discovered that radioactive material had spread throughout Goiânia like an invisible cloud of danger. So panic began to spread. The cleanup effort was really difficult. The entire city needed to be cleared out and whole neighborhoods were cleaned up. They tore down houses, removed topsoil, and placed the radioactive waste in large concrete containers. It was like an overly dramatic episode of Extreme Makeover, Home Edition. But instead of a lovely makeover, it was more about, let's take everything apart before it kills us. And ultimately, 4 individuals lost their lives due to radiation exposure, and many others were significantly impacted. Next, we're going back to the classic land of stupidity. I mean, liberty. Welcome to 3 Mile Island, where the United States learned a tough lesson. Nuclear power isn't just a costly method of providing electricity, it can also be a dangerous risk if you don't stay alert. Let's take a trip back to 1979, where the disaster unfolded like a dramatic soap opera, but with more radiation and fewer romantic scenes. The scene begins in Middletown, Pennsylvania, where the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant was operating quietly, going about its usual activities. On March 28, 1979, the Unit 2 reactor had a meltdown, showing that even nuclear reactors can have their off days. A small problem quickly turned into the most well-known nuclear disaster in US history. The entire problem started when a cooling system broke down, causing the reactor to shut down entirely. The reactor just said, "Alright, I'm taking a break." But the real problem arose when a relief valve chose to be difficult and wouldn't close as it should, causing the coolant to leak out. As the coolant spilled out, the temperature in the reactor core shot up rapidly, which made the alarms ring. At this point, the reactor operators were rushing to understand what was happening. Honestly, they didn't really have a clue about what was happening. Picture yourself trying to disarm a bomb while following instructions in a language that makes no sense to you. What happens when you combine human mistakes, machine problems, and unreliable tools? A partial meltdown that affected people from Pennsylvania to Washington, D.C. Radioactive gases were let out into the air. But here's the twist, no one knew how much radiation had really gotten away. It's like finding out your milk is past its due date, but no one can say if it happened yesterday or 6 months back. Not knowing makes everything feel so much harder. Once news spread that there was a problem at 3 Mile Island, panic took over. People began to worry because the plant was so close to Pennsylvania's state capital. They thought about evacuating, but in the end they just recommended that pregnant women and children leave the area. So it's like the radiation only affected certain groups of people? That seems like really specific. President Jimmy Carter, who, interestingly, was a nuclear engineer, visited the disaster site a few days later to calm the public and to assure them that everything was under control. But let's face it, when the President of the United States has to look into a nuclear meltdown personally, it's clear that things were not really under control. In the days and weeks that came after, there were more investigations than you'd find at a crime scene on CSI. Everyone was eager to find out who was at fault, and it turned out that the answer was basically everyone. From the operators to the plant designers and the regulatory authorities, everyone played a role in the radioactive project. The good news, no one lost their life directly. The bad news, it frightened the whole nation and raised big doubts about the future of nuclear power in the US. All these situations have been so messed up. If you want to hear about more interesting stuff, then click this video, and if you made it to the end, then subscribe.